Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. Tonight is June the 22nd, 2015, and we've got a number of things we're going to try to get into tonight. Now, before we do, I want to remind you that you catch Truth on the Tracks every Monday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here on UCY.TV. And the shows were being rebroadcast pretty much every single night here at UCY.TV at different times. You can check the show homepage, the network homepage, UCY.TV. You can go to schedule and you'll see when it's being broadcast. So you should be able to catch it being aired 7 nights a week, and of course over at realitybitesradio.com as well. Now, we're going to talk about a number of issues, and I should warn you that I'm a little under the weather this weekend when I'm recording the show, and that the show is actually being recorded on June the 20th. So if you'll bear with me, I have a severe lack of energy and just overall not feeling great. But we're going to get to this information. I was going to bring on a guest, but the recent developments here in my state of South Carolina, I think, bear some touching on tonight on the show, and we'll try to give us a roundup of the news in the Middle East, domestically as well. We'll try to get into this stuff. Now, maybe we'll mention Dennis Hastert too, because it was ironic that last week's broadcast was on the Satanism and pedophilia and ritual abuse issue that we talked about. Apparently, it was a very popular show, and apparently other people were listening to the show and are now covering it as well. And that's a good thing, that information is getting out to people, because it should never be forgotten. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, then go back and listen to last week's show. You can get the archives on the Truth on the Tracks page, or you can go to BrandonTurbeville.com and see last week's show posted up there as well. Before we get into the Charleston shooting situation, I think we should talk about the show itself, right? Monday night, 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, UCY.TV. Also, follow my work at ActivistPost.com, NaturalBlaze.com. Not only that, please go to BrandonTurbeville.com. That is the website where I recommend that you go to read my articles, watch the YouTube videos, listen to the interviews. All the archive versions of this show are there as well. So please go to BrandonTurbeville.com. You can also buy the books as well. So, lots of things happening. Got 2 articles out on the Charleston shooting. One involves the gun control calls. The other is, actually 3 are out this week regarding the shooting. We have the original report, Charleston, South Carolina, mass shooting suspect still at large. We've got the Obama calls for gun control in wake of Charleston church shooting article up as well. They're all at BrandonTurbeville.com where you should go. Now, on, I think, Wednesday was the day. It was June 18th when it was reported. It was June the 17th when the shooting took place. Apparently, a young man by the name of Dylan Roof of Columbia, South Carolina, he's 21 years old, drove to the church in Charleston. It was an AME church, African Methodist Episcopal. It's one of the oldest churches, or black churches, in Charleston. It's historic. And they were apparently having a prayer meeting on Wednesday night. Now, Roof apparently entered the church, spoke with Clementa Pinckney, who was the pastor, and he sat through the prayer meeting, which lasted about an hour. And then he got up and started firing, and he killed, I believe, 9 people in this rampage. Now, it was 9 people that were killed. Now, Clementa Pinckney, who was the pastor of the church, is also a state senator here in South Carolina. The Post and Courier, this is when Roof was still on the run, reported that there was a bomb threat which provided an obstacle to the investigation early on. The New York Times reported at 10:45 p.m. that night that police were seen drawing their weapons and escorting a young man in handcuffs who fit the description that was provided to them about the shooter. Still, the police declared that the gunman was at large and that they didn't have the assailant in custody. So let's get this out of the way. Was this a false flag attack? Was this just a psychopathic rampage, or what was it? Well, it's hard to tell. These things are always hard to tell, whether or not they are instigated provocateurs or whether or not they are actually real events. Now, Roof obviously had some problems if the stories that we hear about him are to be believed. But this case is so convenient for individuals who are either pushing gun control, who would love to see races divided amongst one another, or who would like to see distraction while other things are going on, like trade agreements being passed and that sort of thing. This, we have reports, again, of a second person, and this is the person who's being arrested and escorted by police, and the bomb threat. Now, we don't know the veracity of that. Apparently no bombs were found, but it was reported nonetheless. There are a number of questionable issues regarding this, okay? Not only the bomb threat, not only the second person arrested, but never mentioned again, but the fact that the attack was labeled a hate crime before Roof was even caught and any motive could have been established, right? This was determined to be a hate crime before that. Now, one could argue that the reason it was determined a hate crime was because of the witness reports, and we have a female survivor telling reporters, quote, that the gunman reloaded 5 different times, and that, actually this is a newspaper, and that her son was trying to talk him out of doing the act of killing someone, okay? But he wouldn't listen. The woman says, this is what the female survivor says Roof said as he was engaging in his killing rampage. You rape our women, and you're taking over our country, and you have to go. That's what he told the group, and that's what the female survivor told to reporters. And of course, the Daily Beast actually gave a more full quote that says, he said, I have to do it. You're raping our women, taking over the country. You have to go. I have to do it, being the part that was provided in that report. Details are actually still developing, but keep in mind we are seeing a period of media-driven racial radicalization in this country, and this is playing out on both sides. This is not just blacks or whites. This is taking both races into consideration. Now, let's pay attention to the fact that we had the Walter Scott shooting in North Charleston, which is virtually Charleston's the Charleston area. The Walter Scott shooting, which was an obvious case of murder, much as Roof's case is obvious a case of murder. This one we have on video. We can see that the cop just outright murdered Walter Scott. And, of course, as soon as this happened on the hills of Ferguson, everyone expected riots and destroying your own neighborhoods and attacking white people and all of that kind of stuff that tends to go along with these things. But it didn't happen because the family came out. First of all, the city fired the cop, charged him with murder, as well as they should have. And the family told Al Sharpton and the rest of his race-baiting parasitical class of snitches and double agents and provocateurs to get the hell out of South Carolina and to go, suck off of somebody else's wallet for a while. And they did. They didn't have a choice. They had to get out of Charleston because they weren't welcome. And as a result, what happened was that there were demonstrations. Black Lives Matter crap did come out, but it was subdued because the people of Charleston recognized that this was a wrong and that what they would have wanted to happen, in other words, the cop to be fired and arrested and charged, had happened. And that the family pleaded for calm in this situation, and we handled it like civilized people. This is how we're supposed to handle things, right? The cops murder an innocent man, and we stand up and say, you're not getting away with it, and then the cop is charged. Now, if the cop is released, then somebody obviously is going to have to take to the streets and demonstrate and really make their voice heard, but this is going to be a lengthy process. I say all this to point out the fact that there was an attempt to create a riot in Charleston, South Carolina, and it didn't work. We move on to Baltimore, and then Baltimore obviously turns into the third world on steroids, and now we're back in Charleston again. So the first one didn't work, and we're wondering if this is the second try. Now, this kid, this Dylan Roof guy, you can look at his pictures and you can tell, A, by the haircut, but B, by the fact that you can look at his face and you can tell that there's something amiss, right? That this is not quite a normal person. Now, he apparently has been he's been found to have been possessing a drug known to be a drug that weans people off of meth or heroin, and that side effects to this drug are, well, much like Prozac, in that it can cause depression and, I believe, homicidal tendencies and that sort of thing. So we don't know if that was involved or not, but the kid obviously does not look like a sane individual. And I don't mean a legitimately crazy person. What I'm referring to is that he doesn't look like he's in full control of all his faculties. Not an excuse, not arguing to not to punish him or anything, but we just got to point this out. Now, Clementa Pinckney, the victim, the pastor, and the state senator. It's interesting that Obama happened to know Clementa Pinckney. He actually said this in a speech, said that he knew the pastor, and Pinckney had apparently been out campaigning with Hillary at some point, so this is very interesting nonetheless. Now, the photos that were released of Roof, we only got one photo of him walking into the church. Then all of a sudden we were provided with another photo, and this is a photo of him sitting out in the woods apparently. He's in a jacket with two flags, which are the apartheid-era flags for Rhodesia, or what was called Rhodesia, and another I can't remember. And so it's pretty obvious. And what we'd have to say is this the Oswald photo? Is this the famous Patsy photo of a rifle and two passports to Russia? Or is this legitimate? Well, I'll tell you what, it was released first by the Southern Poverty Law Center. And I start immediately, anything that has to do with the SPLC, I have to question. SPLC, of course, heavily connected to the ADL, which has infiltrated many police departments across the country. It's a hate group, it's a radical group, and it's a very dangerous group. So anything having to do with the SPLC is very questionable. Of course, they've been harping on white racism, white supremacism, and, of course, domestic terrorists and these conservative groups. And, of course, some of these groups are problematic, but the SPLC, of course, lumps a lot of people in. Anybody who doesn't agree to their, agenda is, of course, called a hate group. Just simply listing black on white crime is now criteria for the SPLC to call you a hate group, and that's what they do. So bear in mind, a lot of memes getting shared on Facebook from the Southern Poverty Law Center. The fact that this organization was the first to provide this photo is very questionable, to say the least. It's also questionable how they got it. So I'd like to know from the Southern Poverty Law Center, how did you get the photo? If you got it off of Facebook, all right. Well, if you got it off of Facebook, you got it off of Facebook. But regardless, the involvement with the Southern Poverty Law Center is very concerning. Now, of course, immediately the race situation comes to the forefront, right? We have the argument, of course, we have a lot of people out as soon as the media begins calling this a hate crime, a race crime, white on black, white on black. The media, of course, reporting white man kills black people, essentially, as the media always does. We turn into two separate ideas, right? And one of them is gun control from Obama and his crowd. And, of course, we get how evil white people are. White people, this is just the new Jim Crow, the new slavery, and all of that kind of stuff, right? We even got reports saying that South Carolina basically is the headquarters of white racism in the South. Well, I live in the South. I live in South Carolina. I can tell you that that is bullshit. Now, we have our problems here in South Carolina, clearly, as we do all across the country. Racial problems, sure. Do we have the Klan in South Carolina? Yes, we have the Klan. A lot of people would be surprised to figure out what the Klan actually is and who's actually a member of it. It's not the buck-tooth retards that you see on TV necessarily out walking around in their grandma's sheets and dime store hoods. It's actually members of people who are police and judges and lawyers and that type of thing, who are generally connected with the Freemasonic lodges. And that's why they're able to get away with a lot of these things. But of course, they've drummed up the white racism hysteria to the point that we've got many people, provocateurs, out in the streets of Charleston calling for race wars. Of course, black people, these provocateurs, were calling for race wars and for the shooting to start. And this is, of course, all on CNN. CNN has posted it up there as well. And, of course, we got the white liberal class promoting the white racism as well. White people are getting sick of it and are beginning to speak out back. And this is what is happening, is that you are essentially causing the racial problem by this media campaign, right? So there is racial tension in the area. There is racial tension out and about. But what I'll say is that in Charleston, there have been a number of vigils around the church that have been attended by blacks and whites who have hugged each other, shaken each other's hand, expressed grief for one another, and support for one another. So if you are one of the provocateurs, why don't you just get the hell out and go cause trouble somewhere else? But of course, we know what's going to happen. We're going to have race baiters and parasites like Al Sharpton come in, like the Black Lives Matter crap, which is funded by George Soros. And then we're going to get everybody fighting with one another if somebody doesn't put a stop to this. So for the people who've asked me what the situation is like, yes, of course there's racial tension, but if you go on Facebook, you'll find more racial tension because it's the internet. So, obviously you have to be concerned about this stuff, but the internet is not necessarily an accurate representation of real life. So be consoled with that. Now, of course, Obama has now called for gun control in the wake of the shooting. And this is before the corpses of the victims there were even cold. We had the local Charleston oligarchs, we had the mainstream media, and of course, Obama coming out to blame the atrocity on the availability of guns. So the international disgrace known as Barack Obama was able to read the speech that he had these well-paid writers provide him. But before he did that, we had this corrupt and notoriously corrupt weasel known as Mayor Joe Riley in Charleston. Managed to get a baseball park named after himself, unfortunately. He went on to this tirade against gun ownership, right? And the Washington Post quotes him, and this is what he has to say. I personally believe there are far too many guns out there, and access to guns, it's far too easy. Our society has not been able to deal with that yet. Well, guns are less accessible than they've ever been in American history. You used to be able to buy a gun at the post office, you used to be able to buy a gun at the hardware store, and you can't do that anymore. You didn't have to get background checks at one time, now you do. So, our society has not been able to deal with that yet. His statement would lead you to believe that it's a new development and we haven't been able to adapt. When in reality, guns are less available than they were in the past, and maybe our society hasn't been able to adapt to that. But so Riley's logic is really skewed there. But he says he's going to continue to push on. He called the killings another example of why more gun control measures should be enacted, and he says he criticizes the easy ability for people to gain possession of them. No doubt contributes to violent acts. Well, how many people has this police department killed? We'd have to ask. But Obama came out and followed suit, and he comes out and says, "Let me read you this pathetic statement from Obama." He says, "We don't have all the facts, but we do know that once again, innocent people." Let me find this again. the internet is causing. Here we go. We don't have all the facts, but we do know that once again innocent people were killed in part because someone who wanted to inflict harm had no trouble getting their hand on a gun, says a person who's killed hundreds of thousands or millions of people. The pot calling the kettle black there. It is in our power to do something about it. I say that recognizing that politics in this town foreclose a lot of those avenues right now, but it'd be wrong for us not to acknowledge it, and at some point it's going to be important for Americans to come to grips with it, for us to be able to shift how we think about the issue of gun violence collectively. Yeah, well, maybe we'll start to listen to you when you stop killing hundreds of thousands of innocent people. I've had to make statements like this too many times. Well, shut the hell up. We'd all be happy about that. Communities like this have had to endure tragedies like this too many times. Now is the time for mourning and for healing, but let's be clear, at some point we as a country will have to reckon with the fact that this type of mass violence does not happen in other advanced countries. It doesn't happen in other places with this type of frequency. Well, the speech that Riley gave and the speech that Obama gave in such close proximity was so similar it almost sounded like a script. But regardless, it's definitely propaganda, and the gun grabbers are not going to let a good crisis go to waste. So we're not going to sit here and try to debate and really debate the issues of guns and the benefits of guns and that sort of thing because we don't have the time, and we've done that before. But again, as I say, crocodile tears from somebody who routinely orders the murder of children overseas is something that I'm not really interested in seeing. Now, he described the Sandy Hook shooting as one of the worst days of his presidency. Well, that's hard to believe because he didn't mind engaging in jokes about the drones he used to kill children in Yemen or Pakistan or other countries. He didn't mind bragging about the illegal and immoral war against Gaddafi and the murder of Gaddafi with that cackling witch, Hillary Clinton. He didn't mind doing that at all. Now, by the way, his claims that mass shootings do not happen in other countries, well, they do. And when they do, they're generally much more dramatic because of the fact that most of the population is disarmed. As far in terms of the frequency of mass shootings, we got to mention that a lot of these mass shootings that the anti-gun campaign and the Obama administration piggybacked on or taken advantage of in the last few years are questionable to say the least when it comes to their origins. You only have to look at the facts surrounding the Sandy Hook shootings to see that this official story was untrue. In fact, the involvement of intelligence agencies has been highly implicated in the Sandy Hook event, as well as a number of other shootings like the Aurora Batman shooting. So when you're looking and trying to understand the reason behind the uptick in mass shootings, perhaps we should look at the Obama administration, the U.S. intelligence agencies, and other members of the deep state before we look at Joe Bob in Texas. Now, whether or not the Charleston church shooting is a staged provocation is yet to be determined. There are certain, as I mentioned earlier, coincidences, just as the fact that it occurred in South Carolina, in Charleston, with an individual that knew Obama, all that kind of stuff. We've been over that. So, it's questionable to say the least, but we see how it's being played out. And in terms of division, racial division, it certainly has done a lot to promote racial division. Now, speaking of race, I've got an article out on the issue of racial division in the society at large and in the movement itself, and it's called The Only Way Forward in 2015, and I think this is probably one of the more important articles I've written. I encourage people to go find it, Activist Post, BrandonTurbeville.com. Now, the year 2015, I would say that the United States and the rest of the world, by proxy, has found itself at a crossroads, and the time is fast approaching when the United States, the American people, the world's population really is going to have to make a choice between the move toward freedom or the clampdown of total oppression. Right? We really are at a crossroads. Now we know throughout recorded history that that we've had tyrannies arise and they morph into other forms, and the end result has been largely the creation and maintenance of a permanent worldwide oligarchy. And that oligarchy is attempting to ensure the end of all independent thought and the end of all independent action. This oligarchy that I'm talking about has maintained its control by a number of different methods. And the concept of divide and conquer is one of the most important, it's one of the most talked about in the movement, but a movement that continues to misunderstand it, to fall for it. Throughout history, we've had divisions of race, of religion, of national borders, of class. All of these have been used to keep the many from viewing the few as the enemy. Now, in the past, there have been times where this facade has shown cracks, and there's been individuals who've been able to show that they have a perception of this obstacle and that they've been able to make strides in overcoming it. Those individuals did do their best, but they were silenced or murdered for doing that. Right? We had the murders of JFK, of RFK, of MLK, and all of these murders are testaments to this fact, right? Particularly with Martin Luther King Jr., the danger to the oligarchy was not so much his fight for civil rights for black Americans, or even his opposition to the Vietnam War, or his concerns for labor or labor rights, or what the threat each of these ideas posed to the oligarchy. It was his ability to unify the interests, the varied interests that were involved there. In other words, black civil rights activists, white war protesters, blue-collar workers. He was able to unify these. He was working to unify them, and that was what represented the greatest threat to the oligarchy. Now, in 2015, we've experienced decades of declining political interest and political knowledge on the part of the general public. We've had a few short years of increasing political awareness because of the alternative media. It seemed like the tide was turning, but unfortunately that tide started turning again in the downward trajectory. In 2015, the presence of traditional activists has dramatically declined because of the general lack of interest in political affairs amongst the general public. But even among the alternative media and activists who call themselves, say that they're awake, the focus is largely on money now and self-promotion rather than any type of cause. We have a rally cry in the alternative media, which has come to my website, listen to my radio show, buy my book, instead of just a cry to bring more individuals into the movement as a whole. I mean, personally, I don't care if you listen to my show or someone else's show, if you understand the information and you're able to gain something from it and then put it to use. I couldn't care less which one you listen to. Whichever one works best for you is what I want to see. The focus now, unfortunately, in the alternative media is stealing listeners and stealing readers away from other radio shows and websites, as opposed to just stealing empty heads away from the oligarchy. Now, we've had political divisions take America down to the lowest depths of division that we've seen in decades. We've had religious tensions reaching a new height. We've had racial tension increasing, tension between genders, between people of different sexual orientations. We've got racial movements like the Black Lives Matter crap being promoted by the Soros-funded left, and you've got the radical Christian conservative rabid Draw Muhammad contest and anti-Muslim protest, and all that being promoted from neocon networks, and a number of other agitational movements, right? America is as divided now as it has ever been. Now, those people who are concerned with political developments are generally siphoned off into Republican versus Democrat debates or liberal versus conservative debates. And any issue that arises of any substance is quickly pushed off into one of those two camps. You support the Second Amendment, you've got to be a crazy right-wing white Republican. You support workers' rights, labor protections, you've got to be a socialist liberal Democrat. If you oppose mandatory vaccination, you must be an anti-science Republican, right? Oppose police brutality, you got to be black and anti-white. You oppose war, you got to be an anti-American commie. You get the picture, right? You have opinions that don't fit into the mold, then obviously you're a conspiracy theorist and domestic terrorist. Now, In the alternative media, even among the alternative media and the activist communities, political pedigrees have become major obstacles, right? We've got libertarians bitching and fighting with socialists, and you got conservatives fighting with liberals. You got anarchists fighting with everybody. Hell, anarchists fight with themselves. So all these groups have allowed egos, they've allowed minor differences to stand in between them and their ultimate goal, which should be the change that they're trying to make. I'll give you an example. We got pro-gun groups who are not interacting with other pro-gun groups, even as the Second Amendment is under serious attack. These are pro-gun groups. We've got groups here in South Carolina that simply won't work with one another because they have a slight or minor difference. And then we've got white gun groups, and we've got black gun groups and proponents, and they don't work with one another. Now, this doesn't mean that the reason they don't work with one another is racism, but it demonstrates a disconnect among both communities. But it's a disconnect that we can't afford at this point in time. Now, an example would be that a recent open carry protest that have been taking place all across the country. These protests have caused a big stir because the brainwashing the American people have been subjected to regarding guns, and especially when those guns are carried out in the open. The overwhelming majority of these protesters were conservative. Most of them, overwhelming majority, were white. And they've taken place all across the country. But later on, the Huey P. Newton Gun Club, which is a black group, announced a similar protest. And they invited all interested parties, black and white, to attend. But the end result of that was two protests, different protests. One was a black one, and the other was a white one. But there was only ever one issue. And that was an issue that both parties agreed upon. So blacks didn't show up for the white protest, and whites didn't show up for the black protest. And both absences were tragic squanderings of an opportunity for members of two different communities to reach out and express solidarity with one another. Even if the only accomplishment was to express support for the Second Amendment, that's still a drastic step forward. Now, the Second Amendment isn't the only issue where that racial divide has played a part. Now, it was not the first, but it's got to be the last. In California recently, the SB 277 bill that would have eliminated most of the vaccine exemptions for children in California, we had this gathering of protesters to basically speak out against the California government there. And the protesters in the crowd, most of them were white, at least from the videos that I saw. They were joined by members of the black community, specifically members of the Nation of Islam. And this is not two communities necessarily that you would think were going to start working together, wouldn't have much common cause, but they do. Now, the individuals in this protest movement were of different backgrounds, some conservative, some liberal, some independent, and there's no doubt that these people would have loved to have greater participation in their rally, more individuals fighting for their cause. They would have had liked to have more people involved in working with their groups, and they would have liked to work with the black community as well. And on the other side, the black community would also be interested in this as well, because black people have largely distrusted vaccines for decades because they were the guinea pigs and the people who were experimented on for extermination campaigns and so forth in the past. So many informed members of this community would have undoubtedly wanted to have their voice heard as well. So why is this so hard to accomplish? The media has provoked a racial divide, and it's growing more and more tense each time we bring this George Soros-funded Black Lives Matter crap out. Every time we have the Koch-funded Fox racial stirring or defense of brutal police. It doesn't matter if the cops assassinate an unarmed black teen, it's the fault of the black teen just because he had saggy pants or something like that. That's all been extremely successful in convincing members of both of these communities that the other community is not to be trusted. Well, here's a news flash. You've both distrusted one another for decades, and for decades, activists in general have been fighting for the same exact things. And have you achieved it? No. They've been steadily losing ground with each passing year. After the death of Martin Luther King, that general time period, Americans as a whole have been moving backwards, not forward, in nearly every single category. So we've got a simple lesson to learn here. Separate isn't working. It's time to try something else. Now, it seems like some people have finally started to figure this out, but the Nation of Islam joined the anti-MB277 rally. It was not only an expression of both communities' willingness to work together and engaged in enlightened mutual self-interest. Enlightened mutual self-interest is very important. It was also a message to all the other activists that this is the way forward. It was a message to the oligarchy that blacks and whites, at least the more astute ones, are tired of being played against one another. Now, I'm going to read part of, we'll get on that in a minute. But take the vaccine issue specifically. And Heather Callahan did a good article about this up at Natural Blaze and Activist Post. Blacks and whites unite against big pharma or vaccinations or something like that. You can find it and Google it. But it's clear that big pharma has used all of these psychological weapons to demonize opponents of forced vaccine bills. That would going to remove these exemptions and that sort of thing. And they're clearly astroturfing. They're clearly engaging in media manipulation. They're using typical witch hunt lingo, painting the narrative to demonize opponents of vaccination. They're forming a debate where there was not a debate, because as Heather Callahan points out in her article, debates usually involve two parties and not driven just by one. But they've twisted this so-called debate into this left-right debate, which is causing more confusion. It's trying to say the media tried to shame liberals and blame middle-class, white people, particularly for causing disease outbreaks, even though California's children are 97% vaccinated. They drove the choice in this regard into a right-left issue and said that you're uneducated, stodgy, you're outdated, you're anti-science, and that sort of thing. And then they pulled out Republicans' token candidates, Ben Carson and Tom Sowell, who give the Republicans the ability to say anything they want, and they continually say the most dumb, retarded things that they can say possible. They pulled them out, and they came out in full support of vaccines. And of course, Thomas Sowell is apparently educated by Big Pharma and Rockefeller-funded Hoover Institute. That's another story. But we had other people in the black community who weren't playing along with that. And that was Louis Farrakhan and Tony Muhammad. And whatever you think of the Nation of Islam, they said no. They are not coming out and saying that they just want a choice. No, they've said you're not going to vaccinate our children with this crap against our will. And they've spoken out with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. about these vaccines. And I think Tony Muhammad said, we are not going to stand by and see another Tuskegee experiment happen again. Now, if there is any hope for this country and for the rest of the world, it's going to lie in the ability for individuals who are part of the masses to put away their differences and work together. This is not some we are the world, pie in the sky, let's all hold hands and love each other, we're all the same and all that kind of stuff. None of this stuff. I'm not interested in that. It's all sappy. This is the concept of enlightened self-interest and enlightened mutual self-interest. Peace and harmony is the ideal. If we all sit around and love one another and we don't judge one another based on our race or our skin color, that's great. We should strive for that. That's the ideal. Friendship, understanding, compassion, all of this is ideal. But in the absence of the ideal, we have to be willing to accept a mutual understanding that for our own self-interest is inextricably linked with one another. Nobody's asking you to like one another. But we've got to begin to recognize common interests. We've got to begin setting aside these differences, at least just temporarily, before we lose everything. Now, King understood this concept, and he did what he could to implement it, and it was such a threat to the oligarchy that it got him killed. So if it was such a threat to the system that it got Martin Luther King Jr. killed, then why in the hell aren't we trying it now? We've got to do what we can to bring this stuff down and at least land a few blows in response and not continue to be victims. So if you're listening to this broadcast, part of the responsibility is going to be on you to go out and reach out to other people, not just other people you feel comfortable with. people you may not even necessarily like if you're organizing some type of movement. You're going to have to work with people you don't necessarily appreciate. If you've got a mutual interest, enlightened mutual self-interest, then there is no reason you can't work together. And we've got to start doing that. It's imperative. Now, let's move on. We need to talk about some other developments domestically, and I want to mention the Freedom Act. I did an interview with Redline of Sputnik, and we discussed the Freedom Act issue. That's up at the website. A couple of interviews are up at the website. My interview with Sputnik, Redline, also with Al-Ateja out of Lebanon, and Fox News as well. It's all up at the website. Go check it out. But let's see if we can mention this Freedom Act issue, which took place on June the 3rd. We've got mainstream media outlets and even some privacy advocates were very happy about the passage of the Freedom Act and saying that this was a welcome step forward and it was a sign of defeat for the Patriot Act. The bill actually was, not a victim for privacy or freedom at all. It was actually a nail in the coffin of freedom and privacy. We've got people who promoted the bill, like James Sensenbrenner, who was one of the architects of the Patriot Act. It came on the heels of the second U.S. Circuit Court decision that bulk telecommunications data collection was not authorized by the Patriot Act. It was unconstitutional and an illegal act. So, to point out, the Freedom Act had been in the works for passage since 2013 when the lawmakers began pushing it, but at the time the bill actually attempted to extend the Patriot Act provisions to the end of 2017 as well as maintain a number of violations of civil liberties and privacy concerns. So the new version of the Freedom Act is no better necessarily, the one that was passed. It was only different in the language that was used to promote it. Now, when the Second Circuit Court ruled that the Patriot Act didn't authorize bulk collection of data nationwide and that doing so violates the Constitution, it essentially made the actions of the NSA and the rest of the U.S. intelligence apparatus illegal. The Freedom Act didn't do anything to punish or prevent intelligence agencies who've been illegally wiretapping American citizens. It simply legalized the process. So the bill is actually able to legalize the storage and collection of bulk data by putting the responsibility on the back of the major telecommunications companies who are going to be tasked with just doing just that. They're going to store and retain all the data for the intelligence agencies for their future use. And then that data has to be turned over to the agencies upon request. Essentially is the privatization of mass surveillance. Now, the telecom giants are going to be in charge of the data collection and have worked hand in glove with intelligence agencies for some time. But now the law is going to require them to do so. So it should remember that at the top levels of many of these corporations, the surveillance and intelligence apparatus, along with the capitalist and governing corporate boards, are generally one and the same. So I want to read something that comes out from Daniel McAdams of the Ron Paul Institute, and he talks about how the Freedom Act influences the collection of data in the private sphere. And he says, number one, the recent decision of the Second U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals that the bulk collection of American citizens' telecommunications information was not authorized by the USA Patriot Act means that of this afternoon, the bulk collection of American citizens' telecommunications information was an illegal act. The government was breaking the law each time it grabbed our metadata. The moment the Freedom Act is signed by President Obama, that same activity will become legal. How is making an unconstitutional and illegal act into a legal one a benefit to civil liberties? Well, let me correct him on one thing, is that there have been so many executive orders and so many other laws passed that did allow for the NSA to do what it was doing. And, of course, do you really believe they're going to stop doing that? So there was no danger of that surveillance ending on the night that the Patriot Act would allegedly expire. Point two, the Freedom Act turns private telecommunications companies into the agents of state security. They will be required to store our personal information and hand it over to state security organs upon demand. How do we know this development is a step in the wrong direction? It is reportedly the brainchild of General Keith B. Alexander, the NSA director at the time. According to press reports, this was but a public relations move to deflect criticism of the bulk collection program. Alexander saw the move as a way for Obama to respond to public criticism without losing programs the NSA deemed more essential, reports Homeland Security News. Point 3. The Freedom Act turns private telecommunications companies into depositories of pre-crime data for future use of state security agencies. It is a classic authoritarian move for the state to co-opt and subsume the private sector. Once the Freedom Act is signed, American telecommunications information will be retained by the telecommunications companies for the use of state security agencies in potential future investigations. In other words, an individual under no suspicion of any crime and thus deserving full Fourth and Fifth Amendment protection will nevertheless find himself providing evidence against his future self should that person ever fall under suspicion. That is not jurisprudence in a free society. Point 4. The Freedom Act provides liability protection for the telecommunications firms who steal and store our private telecommunications information. In other words, there is not a thing you can do about the theft as long as the thief is a private agent of the state. End quote. So, the bill really leaves loopholes in language wide enough you could drive a truck through. For instance, doesn't define the term direct connection, which would allow the NSA to access data on Americans through their smartphones. We have private providers, which would largely be seen as an expansion of NSA power, I guess, if you're a follower of the mainstream, but that's despite the fact that limits on power have never really been a concern to the NSA before. Now, the bill that was presented and passed, it was presented as a negation of Section 215 of the Patriot Act, used by the Bush administration and the Obama administration to justify bulk data collection. It actually makes the telecom companies the first-level collators of this information. And intelligence agencies able to request the data from them at any time based on keywords, presumably like the myriad of publicly admitted words used for surveillance triggers today. But we've got many privacy organizations agreeing to support the bill. We've got ACLU Deputy Legal Director Jamil Jaffer stated that, quote, this bill would make only incremental improvements, and at least one provision, the material support provision, would represent a significant step backwards. The disclosures of the last 2 years make it clear that we need wholesale reform. Now, another organization that supported the bill, but was hoping that Congress improved it, was the Center for Democracy and Technology, who admitted that the so-called limits to the Patriot Act provisions were virtually non-existent. This is what it says. It says, the USA Freedom Act of 2015 is not as comprehensive as CDT would prefer and leaves several problems unaddressed. Notably, the bill omits an important provision that was present in the version Senator Leahy introduced in 2014. The Senate 2014 bill, which CDT supported but which failed to proceed in the Senate, would have required the government to limit the retention of information about individuals with no connection to a suspect or foreign power. This enhanced minimization language would have helped mitigate privacy problems raised by surveillance that is not bulk collection. In addition, the new bill's transparency provisions require scant reporting on surveillance conducted under Section 702 of FISA. End quote. So we've got two privacy organizations, and this is generally how it works. You have the government trying to take away your privacy, so you then have these privacy watchdogs and safeguard organizations that come out and say, we're gonna stand up for privacy, and we'll be the safeguard against any attacks on your privacy, and then they cave whenever you need them the most. Now, we have an article by Shane Harris of the Daily Beast in the weeks leading up to the passage of the Freedom Act, and let's see if we can get through some important quotes here that are relevant. Civil libertarians and privacy advocates were applauding yesterday after the House of Representatives overwhelmingly passed legislation to stop the National Security Agency from collecting Americans' phone records, but they'd best not break out the bubbly. The real big winner here is the NSA. Over at its headquarters in Fort Meade, Maryland, intelligence officials are high-fiving because they know things could have turned out much worse. What no one wants to say out loud is that this is a big win for the NSA and a huge nothing burger for the privacy community, said former senior intelligence official, one of a half a dozen who have spoken to the Daily Beast about the phone records program and efforts to change it. Here's the dirty little secret that many spooks are loath to utter publicly, but have been admitting in private for the last 2 years. The program, which was exposed in documents leaked by Edward Snowden in 2013, is more trouble than it's worth. It's very expensive and very cumbersome, the former official said. Not really. It requires the agents to maintain huge databases of all Americans' landline phone calls, but it doesn't contribute many leads on terrorists. It has helped prevent few, if any, attacks, and it's nowhere near the biggest contributor of information about terrorism that ends up on the desk of the president and other senior decision makers. So there we go. We've also got a current senior U.S. official telling the Daily Beast, quote, "Good, let them take them. I'm tired of holding on to this." So, Joel Brenner, the NSA's former inspector general, also told the Daily Beast, "It's a big win for common sense and for the country. NSA can get to do what it needs to do with a higher level of scrutiny and a little more trouble," meaning a phone call to say, hey, give us this data, but it can do what it needs to do. At the same time, the government is not going to hold the bulk metadata of the American people. What no one wants to say out loud is that this is a big win for the NSA and a huge nothing burger for the privacy community. Another former official, the NSA is coming out of this unscathed. All right, so another guy says, "That's great. I think no one thought it was in the realm of possibility before this bill." So the intelligence community is quite happy about it. Now, the so-called gains that civil libertarians supposedly made with the Freedom Act, they're non-existent. The Daily Beast could only really find one to mention of, and even that has nothing to do with the bill itself. It's simply the fact that millions of Americans now know they've been spied on for the last decade. Well, I don't know how that's a win at all. But Julia Sanchez of the Cato Institute, she has tried to paint the bill as a level-headed agreement, but she admits that it gives the NSA greater flexibility as well. This is what she says. "I'd certainly agree it's not a loss for the NSA in any meaningful way. Indeed, there are some respects in which a shift to the carrier-centric model is likely to give them greater flexibility by allowing them to query on data the FISC order doesn't permit them to collect." Okay, so it was also in the article that I did, I linked to a lengthy summary of the Freedom Act by Justin Amash, which was actually pretty good. But what's most important to mention here is that we have the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 11th Circuit ruling that Americans have no perception of privacy when it comes to records that are being held by a third party. And once you understand that, you can see why the NSA would be high-fiving in the break room about the new massive data centers that now can just either spy on one of these telecom organizations or request the information itself and automatically have all the data in the world. So the Freedom Act was never, even if the Freedom Act was never passed and relevant sections of the Patriot Act were allowed to expire, again, as I said, the power of the NSA would not have been diminished because illegal government spying has taken place with every new advent of technology and communications since even long before 9/11. With the knowledge that programs like Sentient World Simulation is in existence, as well as the ability to record and store all of the information on one individual for less than the cost of a mobile home, which I've reported on, got an article on, Americans would be naive to think that a change on paper would change the surveillance state that they are living in. Now, just a couple of quick updates. We've only got a couple of minutes here. On June 8th to June the 13th, I believe is the date. June 8th to June 10th, we had the Ukrainian Prime Minister Arseniy Yatseniyuk, or Yats the Rat, arriving in the United States to discuss Ukrainian territorial integrity and economic cooperation with the leaders of the United States and the IMF. Now, the Ukrainian Minister of Finance, Natalie Jaresko, who's not Ukrainian, was also part of the delegation. Yatsenyuk was going to meet with the leadership of the U.S. as well as U.S. Speaker of the House John Boehner, representatives from the U.S. Democratic and Republican parties, U.S. Secretary of Energy Ernest Moniz, and U.S. Secretary of the Treasury Jacob Lew. Yats was going to also meet with Christine Lagarde, who's the managing director of the International Monetary Fund, and other representatives from the IMF. He also met with the UN Undersecretary General Jeffrey D. Feltman, and in addition to meeting with the Ukrainian community in America, he met with the American Jewish Community's Global Forum. So there we are. basically translated into real terms, we had the meetings which were involving discussions regarding, austerity measures, greater austerity measures to be implemented in Ukraine, the growing tensions with the Donetsk People's Republic, the Lugansk People's Republic, Novorossiya, Russia, those types of questions, and basically the crisis that was started by the U.S.-backed fascist coup in Ukraine. So we've already got austerity measures imposed on the Ukrainian people. It's been reported that there's been more plans to implement even greater measures of austerity. That's pretty much official. Privatized industries, services, cutting social safety net benefits, privatizing and asset stripping the country's natural resources, all of that stuff. So this is all coming on the heels of the fact that the DPR and the LPR has nationalized their banks. Obviously not something that the oligarchs would like to see them do. So we are running out of time for the show. Next week we're going to pick up the question of what's happening in Syria, simply because we are nearing the June 30th deadline, and I have a feeling that there may be more major developments in the Middle East as we move forward toward June 30th. And this could involve Iran, Syria, Yemen, it could involve Libya, it could involve Iraq, it could involve Lebanon. There are a number of different places that this could take place, and there's always the possibility that it would take place in Ukraine as well, and that's a very dangerous situation. So we'll be paying attention to that, and hopefully the week after we will be able to cover the Syrian crisis. So, ladies and gentlemen, this has been Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville. We'll see you next week.
For more news, visit pigminews.com.